Welcome everyone. I'm Brianne Rosner. I'm the Gallery and Craft Fair Director at Peters Valley School of Craft. We are delighted that you could join us tonight for Dominique Ellis's Artist Lecture, which is co-hosted by Peters Valley School of Craft and the Pike County Public Library. For those of you not familiar with Peters Valley, we are located in northwestern New Jersey in the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. The school hosts immersive workshops, youth art programs, artist residencies, retail and exhibition galleries, and an annual craft fair. The Pike County Library in Milford, Pennsylvania is just over the Delaware River from us, and it is where we've hosted these lecture series before the pandemic. So the program is funded by the Greater Pike Community Foundation and the Richard L. Snyder Fund, and we are so grateful for their support, so thank you to them. Before we begin, a couple formalities. Since this is a lecture, this is a webinar format, so attendees do not have control over their video or audio. That said, we do encourage you to type any comments in the chat, which you can find a button for at the bottom of your screen. And also, please tell us where you're from. Not only do we need this information for our funders, but it is amazing to see how far away so many of you are. And we love that we can come together virtually because we know that many of you couldn't join us in person. So we are so happy that we can all be here together to hear more tonight. And in addition to the chat feature at the bottom, you will see that there's a Q&A. And there you can put in any questions that you have for Dominique. And then if we have time at the end, we will answer those questions. So now I would like to introduce Dominique Ellis. Dominique received her MFA in printmaking at Tyler School of Art in 2013. She was awarded a U.S. Fulbright Student Scholarship for Egypt for printmaking, as well as an Arabic language grant for 2009 to 2010 and was based in Cairo, Egypt. Dominique served as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco from 2006 to 2008, working in the Moroccan Ministry of Handicrafts. She's currently the retail manager and gallery coordinator at the Clay Studio in Philadelphia. Welcome, Dominique.
Hi, everyone. I just want to say thank you for everyone for coming. I know can't actually see who's all here, so I look forward to hearing all your thoughts, and please, leave as many questions as you can, and I will get started. So in thinking about what is the kind of topics that I've been thinking about before getting started for the presentation, this book, The Shape of Time, has been in my backpack for the last 3 years, as well as this catalog, which I will talk about further, and I will expand on what the two of them mean. The catalog is Viola Fry's exhibition catalog from 1984 that was at Moore College of Art. And from this catalog that Ruth Snyderman gave me as the Snyderman Works Gallery in Philadelphia was closing, it heavily influenced the way that I thought and saw my own practice, and also helped me to lead me to The Shape of Time, which are two major influences in my career. So I'm going to do a screen share, and let's see. Share. And so The Shape of Time is thinking through history in a way that, for me, isn't always chronologically centered. I think that memory plays a lot of my own place and time right now at the age of 39, almost 40. I tend to come back to this moment in my history where I'm sitting at my house that I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, on a quilt that my Aunt Margie made for me that had my name. Thinking about the vinyl floor and the shag rug and the black and white TV and my, Fisher Price toys. It was a moment that captured maybe my innocence and my understanding of myself at that moment, but also looking at how my family has always been part of my history, but the further away I get from Nebraska, I can understand and maybe digest the lessons that I've learned over the years. So I begin with this green screen. It was, my grandmother had 9 children, and on my mother's side, and when I was in elementary school, she was my substitute teacher, as well as later on, she became the computer teacher at my elementary school. And so I started thinking about screen time as a moment that we're all in with the new virtual, world that we're living in, and how simple the computer technology was at that point. Looking at the kinds of games that I would play on floppy disks and the choices and the language that these games helped me to formulate what you could decide to be as a young person in the Midwest, looking at the language of history and also what the Oregon Trail was. All of these choices are masculine. And so a lot of times I'm thinking about, or traditionally, I would say there's a heavy influence of masculinity. And so I often would pick probably the carpenter, because it's something that I always liked, working with my hands in a way that I could make a tactile object. I also had the opportunity of working in high school across the hall from my grandfather on my mother's side, who was working at the federal building. And my very first job was working at the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture. So I would go to the federal building and go through the security, and much of my time would be, I was working in the soil survey lab. So I was transcribing microfiche data of soil samples from different depths and different locations around the United States into a new database. So much of my language early on was dealing with transcribing and taking one type of data that maybe became obsolete into a new form of data. It also informed a lot of how I started thinking about color and color theory, even before I had foundations courses at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So Munsell was somebody who was in this prior photograph, created a system of color that I still think to this day helps me understand my tendencies towards thinking about depths of color and color fields in any medium, not just ceramics or printmaking. But these tests or these samples become my vocabulary. I also am a child of the 80s. So as a child of the 80s, I was influenced by space and time and warp speeds and all the things that go with dreaming about a future life outside of Nebraska, for instance, but also how the world was bigger than what I could, see in my own hometown. And it helped me to think about my relationship to time and how time capsules of moments of popular culture influenced the way that I saw the world. So many of the types of time that I'm thinking about are also delayed times. How can time stop still, but also how are we frozen in time? So prior to this moment in Egypt, it was a moment of, I think in terms of my career, I was very far from Nebraska. I see different moments of my life, and one of the recent conversations I had with a friend of mine who, or with a friend, was the way that time in the photograph is very different than the reality of the world around you. So in Egypt, I had the opportunity as a Fulbright to live in a city of 20 million people, navigate history in a way that when I was a child, my first printmaking woodcut was of King Tut. And what I found was, when I was in Egypt, what I was more interested in was the contemporary time, and thinking about how do you define contemporary and how do you define history as they're having these intersections come together. The delayed or the frozen time was something that I think I'm interested in, how both the historical clashes with the contemporary. And when I was in Egypt, the moment that I was there, I was 29, turning 30 years old. And it was one of the most important moments of my life in terms of history and understanding my place. Looking at in the Egyptian uprisings occurred when I had just turned 30. And prior to that, I had also had been walking around with a cane in Cairo. So I started to understand the limitations of my body, because walking so much everywhere, it was the first moment where I really began to have to think about how to slow down my moments of walking and navigating the world. Egypt opened my eyes into an understanding of how to navigate a cosmopolitan, but yet have it feel like a village. Similar, to living in a village in Morocco as a Peace Corps volunteer. All of these moments were, I think, helping shape the way that I saw the rhythms of a city or rhythms of a space, how I navigated and understood public spaces. How I found that in Egypt especially, and as well as Morocco, I found that I laughed abundantly, and there was perhaps the way that my understanding of language helped me to be as carefree as possible. Perhaps it was the immersion that I found myself, but also having a purpose is one of the most important moments of being. I think being in places and having a purpose helps you understand your place in time. And then there are moments where I come back to this, a different kind of time, where trauma-based ideas of time, where you are more than frozen, you get stuck. So much of my career, I would say, and even maybe not using the word career, but my path and my journey through looking at the mediums of printmaking and ceramics as two principal languages that I speak through. They visually speak through. My graduate studies at Tyler School of Art helped me understand my own rhythms of making, and somehow the way that deadlines are the moment where you can either succeed or fail, but the failure is not in that you don't meet the deadline. It's just you understand a different relationship to how time your own sensibility of time does not match with somebody else's moment of time. And perhaps what I'm thinking through also is that these two monoprints, for my 15 credit review, I made all 21 of the images for that review the night before. And so I think somehow there's this urgency, or the rhythm of the momentum of the speed and time and place, where all things come together and coalesce in the same moment of time. And it's not because of being without, like, I guess it's not without having a moment of, what's the right word? It's not that I'm waiting for that deadline to make the work. It somehow I need the deadline to happen so that I understand the sensibility of an urgency of time. My thesis, my graduate thesis show, much of what I learned was not that the static prints on the wall were the finished product, but rather that they are all components that equal something bigger, or they're the accumulation of time embedded in each one of the sheets of paper, and then how I arranged them helped me to understand that palimpsests and slices of time can be moved around. And so what I liked is that nothing was fixed. And I found that the video that was recorded during my thesis by my friend Stephen Kraut helped me to actually understand my practice better. Much of the saturation that I have been thinking through still stems back to perhaps that green screen of the screen time of my early memory of color on a computer screen. Perhaps it's the things that I'm absorbing in the city. During my thesis at Tyler, I also, it was the very first time that I had ever shown ceramics in a formal setting. Even though my background was in ceramics in undergrad at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, much of what I showed, I sold lots of ceramics, but I did not show it. And the delineations between showing and selling are very different. So I'm not trying to make a living off of, at that point, I wasn't trying to make a living, but I was finding that the value of my ceramic pieces in undergrad had maybe a weight where I could trade somebody, or because of its usage. But this piece in particular was a lexicon, and each part of it is a ceramic test tile that stems back to my early memories of working with Pete Pinnell as his assistant for Pepsi Scholarship. And the Pepsi Scholarship was something that allowed me to work for 1 year helping him with his test tiles. And then the following year, I worked on my own test tiles. And at that point, as a early 20-something-year-old, I didn't have an understanding of what those tiles meant, but they continued. The test tile became another indicator of how I understand time. In grad school, I also found that my interest in printmaking and my ceramics has always kind of fluctuated. So there are moments where the language of ceramics supersedes my need for a graphic, 2D image, and vice versa. And so at that point, I had been looking at a lot of vacant lots, and the city of Philadelphia had 40,000 vacant lots. And so this is entitled Tyvek, and much of what I was recording in my commute from my home, where I was living, to campus, on my bike was just how I was absorbing the moments of construction or deconstruction. 2013, I graduated from Tyler School of Art, and this is one of the last pictures that I have of understanding how scale was very important, and also the multiple in creating works of art all at the same time, but also understanding when I need to step back and literally, and not just figuratively, literally step back and look at how the visual is working together or not. And after that moment, I really haven't really made prints in the way that I was in grad school. I think, I had received a grant where I purchased a 2-foot or 3-foot by 8-foot sheet of copper. And at that point, all I wanted to do in grad school was to go make large prints and excavate the copper, and the wood cuts that I was working on were larger than I had ever worked. But then after I got out of school, finding the facilities to do that, and also the time, really changed the way that I looked at my practice. So much of what I absorbed over my years of also screens is thinking through how the last time that I had a television, I think, was perhaps 2000 and I want to say 2005, and how much of my understanding of news and popular culture was mediated through watching, shows or sitting around with friends and seeing, watching similar shows that weren't, somehow there was a removal of a algorithm that would tell me what the best-selling thing was. It just was. So after I graduated from Tyler School of Art, ceramics became, I think I was really relearning again, or picking back up after a break within making. I think much of my flow of how I've worked in any medium has always had these gaps of time. And after I got out of school, I started as a work exchange at the clay studio and started to figure out, I took a slip casting class with my first course there, and then I took different classes over the years. But this piece in particular is a piece that I've never actually shown, but it has become quite a diary, or a moment in time where I had been working on the loading dock at Macy's in Center City, and was working 50 hours a week, and it began to think about my relationship to how I define what is time and what is work, and my I think also it was a record of a moment where I learned that I had to slow down yet again. And, thinking about tagging clothes and being on a mezzanine level in an old building that you had to have someone get you from the freight elevator, and, how these spaces created a moment where, I would get there at 7 a.m. and then leave, my shift at 10:30 in the morning, and then get to the clay studio at 11. So thinking about the rhythms of how much my life has shifted over the last 7 years, I think as as I'm thinking through what is work and what is time, there are moments where I think I'm very serious because work is, what I've noticed, I think, is over the last 7 years, I might be changing my outfit 4 times in one day, where I'm biking to work and then I'm, hugging clay, or I'm loading a kiln and then I'm greeting a customer. I think the understanding the different roles that one might play inform my work, and also the where the playfulness might not occur, or it might just be a record of that moment. Some of the aha moments that I would say I've had began when I started thinking about shapes, and also how color blocks, just started limiting my color palette, and also trying to play with perspective and stacking, and understanding that if I have 1 hour in the studio, what can I do in that 1 hour? I also think that much of the colors started also, maybe again still being saturated, but beginning to understand how to layer on the ceramic tile itself, or on a ceramic piece. So I would looking back at my timeline, I found that teaching I had the opportunity to start teaching at Peters Valley in 2016. And at that moment, I got this rental car. And actually, this is probably the second rental car. The first one that I had was this Volkswagen Beetle. And have often taught in special topics because I'm interested in the way that hybrid, like how 2 languages or 2 mediums can create a new understanding of both mediums, or how it can change how we think about what is what we have been taught. So my first course was an introduction to printing on clay. And then I did a plein air woodcut course. And then the course that really changed my entire understanding, before that was, I guess before that course, I had also in tandem been doing the craft shows there. And so I did the Peters Valley craft show, I believe 2017, where I had never done a craft show before. I really had never seen all of my work in one space. And so I found that I took apart my IKEA shelf from my living room, and I basically took everything out of my house that I thought might fit into the space for the booth. And the weight of doing that also taught me a lot of how hard it is to be an artist especially in clay, where you're lugging around all this equipment and understanding just the burden or the toll that it takes on your body. And at that point, I got an emerging artist award, and it helped me to see what I should do the following years. I also had participated in the American Craft Council. I think dipping my toes into how craft shows worked influences my path, but also helped me to see what wasn't working from a selling point of view. The most successful course that I taught was a quilted monoprint, and that helped me to separate my printmaking into 2 different portfolios. Having one portfolio that is for things that were signed and I could give away or I could sell, and then having the things that I would be more likely to go back and work in or experiment or take risks with. And that helped me to begin to understand how to organize even all the piles of paper and ceramics that I'd been carrying around with me over the years. This piece also began to help me think about a different way of how screen time might work. So coming back to the language of screens, I think the video games and the understanding of how the virtual, trying to understand how virtual works. I think that even the questions that the video game asked me at that early on in my memory of understanding computer language was that there's an interactive part to all these decisions, but also figuring out what is my choice and how do I navigate. So that brings me to The Shape of Time, which is a book that, so I had, when we had started these conversations to be coming up to give a talk at the library up in Milford. Milford is one of my favorite places because it's got this great lineage to science fiction and to, the Milford Writers Conference and all things that I'm interested in. And The Shape of Time, I think over the years, I keep rereading it and maybe perhaps contemplating what it means to have, how this moment in time during the pandemic this year has shifted my understanding of what, or all of our collective understandings of what time is. So the catalog that I mentioned earlier about Viola Fry helped me think about all the ways that I perhaps express myself and also look at the ethnography of places, and I'm interested in material culture and observing patterns of how, of social beings. And when you remove the social component, what is left is the traces of history. So I find myself thinking through not just the relationship of the people that I see every day that I don't take for granted, but also the moments in, the manhole covers and the fire hydrants and all the components that make up a city that are starting to disappear for lots of reasons. So I've been absorbing those kinds of moments over the last 3 or 4 years. I had the opportunity to do a silk screening on clay course with the Fabric Workshop, and that helped me to understand, yet again, building on what I learned at Peters Valley, how group interactions, how much we rely on each other to understand each other and also understand our own practice. And so looking at the moments where I'm teaching, or whether I'm having, my first exhibition, which in the moment, I couldn't figure out the title of it because it was so new and fresh for me. It was part of an exhibition for Antica that was called Garden Feast of Paradise. And it was the first time where I'm working with accumulation and understanding that these shapes inform the way that I didn't feel complete with this piece until people started interacting with it. And so each one of the spots around the table in the front with the shapes on it, each one became interactive and had a sound, and the conversations began to accumulate around the table. And then in hindsight, I called it yield. And part of what I think I'm learning is how to create artwork that is yielding as many, having an idea that yields as many new ideas as possible without creating more labor, and also having, I think I'm starting to see the moments where the power of the image is as important as the piece itself, or it is the piece itself. I think there's something about the ready-made with this piece that, you know, is it a ready-made invention, intervention? How do we communicate through different technologies? And again, so this is a third iteration of trying to think through different ways of how the, you know, the digital comes together, and how my interest in the Bauhaus and Montessori games, where there's a play between play and labor, and I never want to, I think I like the moments where there's something that's fixed or not fixed, which goes back to time. So with time, I also have begun noticing at the clay studio that over the last 7 years of working and observing the incredible community that's been cultivated over the last 46 years, that sometimes the pieces that I am thinking through, this one's called Heirloom, which was in response to my professor, Nick Cripple, who passed away, how also these moments are fleeting, and starting to use expired film and expired paper, and just be visually, pay attention to what's happening around me. The quiet moments of having Bill Daly and Jack Troy, you know, in a conversation together, or this really great image of Mark Burns during his exhibition where, you know, I think it's both documenting the moments of time, but also there's something about the quality of this expired film that helps me to record that moment, and whether I end up recording, you know, responding to it in clay or ceramics or any medium, it somehow encapsulates what that moment felt like. I think remembering how to have moments of silence as well. You know, for me, you know, I think in preparing for this talk all day or all week or all month, I've been thinking about it for, you know, for a long time, but it's different when, you know, I'm here in my room and I'm not seeing your faces, and you know, I think there's something about the audience participation that helps add to also these conversations. And so much of what I want to say is that, you know, the collection of books and thoughts that I have about time, these are some of the stories or some of the influences I've had over the years. Invisible Cities, Harold and the Purple Crayon, and the different shapes that I think also have continued to frame how I think much of my practice may not always be a finished product, but rather something, you know, the proposal of a project that might get rejected. And it is a record of that moment where I can look back and reflect on what I was thinking about and what I was making, but it isn't about having it be this completed, finished thing, because the continuum of making is part of my practice. rhythm analysis, The Little Prince, and most recently Looking Backward, which I think I'm looking backward in order to look forward, but also looking backward and looking from a set point in time, and so like 1850, and looking at this present date and deciding which direction to go in order to understand time differently. Which leads me to some of the last slides that I have, which are, because I want to leave some time for questions, is the project that I've been working on for 3 years. It's almost the 3rd anniversary of walking into this building, which is the John Grass Wood Turning Company. And it's right across the street from where I work, and has been kind of part of my everyday pulse of understanding time, and is my constant to understanding how I grow, and how the city changes, and how a building creates a place for people to be a part of. And so much of what this is the same building, and this is the beginning right here of thinking through the next phase of my art practice, which will build on a company that, looking at its history, and also how to write a book about a neighborhood that is one of the oldest neighborhoods. I find that Old City is such an incredible wealth of information that helps. For the first time, I understand my subject matter in a holistic way, and also my purpose, I think, in what's moving forward. And the last thing that I want to say is, sometimes all these modes of how we navigate the world, whether you are, have your hair down, or you are working in the studio, they're all parts of who we are. And I'm very excited to think about what's next for teaching at Peters Valley, but also how my practice will continue to grow. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dominique.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to open it up to questions, and if you have questions, you can put them in that Q&A. We do have one question from earlier that we can start with. Samuel Hoyle says, each of us in a group were told to introduce ourselves as follows. Divide your life to this point into 3 equal parts. Tell us who you were during each period, what guided your life during that time. So he asks, does that way of defining yourself by time fit your image of yourself?
I think defining myself by time helps me begin to understand myself, or begin to define. But also, for instance, chronology is something that is really an easy method of understanding time. And I think that what I'm most interested in is, moving away from chronological time and moving towards understanding other ways of how we like the perception of time is probably one direction. I don't know if that answers the question, but
we have several questions about books, and I'm not sure. Carly Slade asked, can we hear more about the book? I'm not sure which book. And Rick Nickel asked if you've ever read the poem The Waking.
I have not.
And then somebody else has asked, what was the purple book? Something about rhythm and
rhythm analysis. So Rhythm Analysis was a book that I picked up when I was in Cairo, Egypt. And much of what that had to do with was thinking through the concept of the flaneur, which the flaneur was basically a wanderer, someone that wandered around town and sort of observed without being a participant, from what I believe. And so much of what I saw in walking around Cairo is that I had a hard time stopping and sitting and drawing, because the public spaces were not so easy to navigate. And so I found myself photographing and walking, and probably similar to what I'm doing in Philadelphia, but there it seemed like it was like paying attention to the rhythms of a city was kind of the gist of that book in general.
We did hear back from Carly. The book she was asking about is the book that you're currently working on about the wood turning building.
Oh, okay. So that is, I've been working on it for 3 years, and tentatively it's still called The Belt Driven Years. I think I'm pretty invested in that title. However, research does change. So I'm finding that the more I dig, the more I understand how complex history is. And I'm hopefully going to start with a proposal to do like a QR code that would go scanning a building within Philadelphia, and you scan the building and you would hear to a podcast a story of who maybe would have worked in that building, who might have lived in that building, and begin to understand history in a way that I think much of what I found as a kid, history was the last class I took in undergrad, because the way that it was taught was so removed from my interest in social history and cultural history, and it sort of felt like it had a rigid narrative. And part of what I'm most interested in is having oral history in tandem with data. So I'm looking at the glacial shifts of like, imagine you're looking at Old City and how you also look at a glacier and how it's melting. I think I'm similarly trying to understand how the decibel levels have changed in the city, how wind has changed when they started pushing back the river, and flow of traffic. There's so many things that I think I'm interested in that it will be at least another 4 years for this to actually come to fruition. But I bought a typewriter, and I have a studio where I'm able to, work, and I've hired an assistant to help me with some of the research. So right now I'm tracing the last 50 years of fires within Old City, and also going into basements and digging into understanding like the oldest parts of Old City are the basements. And instead of looking at the building from a historical point of view of being the facade only, I think looking at the basement to redefine what is old. All of Old City, or all of Philadelphia, is old. So that's just a little snippet of, I guess, some of the things I'm thinking about, Carly.
Beth says that the expired film speaks volumes. The expired film images speak volumes to her. What camera did you use? Was it Kodak film? What type of film? And how did you develop the images?
Ooh. So the film was 100 speed. And I found that 3 years ago when I started using my Ricoh camera from the 70s, that I couldn't find film to buy in Old City, even though it's one of the most historically touristy areas, I think, of all Philadelphia. besides maybe Rocky. There, I couldn't find it, and so I found one small store on Market Street of a guy who owned a little souvenir shop, and he gave me some expired film that he had that was from, I think, 2008. And I just, after I shot the roll, I took it to a local lab here in Philadelphia, Indie Photo, and processed it that way. And then I scanned it with a old scanner from 2000. So, I think that all these old technologies and how to make them new is part of, stepping away from things that are, I think part of the technology being old is actually what makes it more charming.
So Leslie asks, can you say more about the ways in which private experience of time concretely affects the making in either medium? Does your personal experience of time change the work completed? Does it matter to the viewer's experience without an artist's explanation? Not that the artist's experience isn't important.
Wait, can you say that again? That's a hefty.
I know. So can you say more about the ways in which private experience of time concretely affects the making in either medium? So I guess clay or printmaking. Does your personal experience of time change the completed work? Does it matter to the viewer's experience without an artist's explanation? Not that the artist's experience isn't important.
These are great questions. So I think to the personal experience of time in either medium, I think, I think there's something about the absorbing of experience like I find that I'm absorbing experience through how I navigate and walk around. And, I'm always jotting down notes and always kind of thinking through how I see things. But in the making itself, I find there's always a disconnect between what I'm thinking and what I actually end up making. And perhaps that is where there might be a moment for explanation. But I think also word of mouth is part of, how I'm going to have to think on this one. But I don't know if I have a concrete answer. There's something about the way that when you are working in process-based mediums that you can get caught up in the process itself. And I find that in this moment, I'm able to see clearly the directions of which I want to go more than I've ever had, I think, in my entire life, because I understand that what I'm working on in any medium is relating to the story and the book that I want to tell. Or that I'm discovering. I think not necessarily what I want to tell. I think it's more what others around me are helping me to see as much as what I see.
Leslie tried to explain, but you guys can also continue this conversation.
I know where you work.
A lot, yeah. But she wants to know if the work is expressing time or the result of the experience of time.
Wait, say it again.
Is the work expressing time or the result of the experience of time?
I think it's both.
Yeah. And then speaking also of time, let me scroll back up because everybody put questions in the chat. Amber asked, how has your sense of time changed since quarantine, if at all?
I think for many, and including myself, that if you're not the relationship to knowing someone that has COVID or has been deeply affected by it, it changes your like I feel very removed in a lot of ways, or protected from the greater sort of pandemic. Somehow this moment, I think I've been able to be more creative and also slow down, and I had a garden, so I feel like I learned a lot about gardening time. And the minute that, you know, with gardening you have to tend to it and pay attention and keep the squirrels away and figure out how to, you know, like the yield that you have isn't, I think that's the biggest part, is being able to just be at home more and understand the rhythms of my neighborhood, where many people think that I live in Old City because I'm there 14 hours a day for 7 days. You know, like I'm in that neighborhood so much, and because it's the root of my principal interest for the book, I think it helped me to get to know my neighbors better. It helped me to you know, I started knowing the dogs in the neighborhood here. And if you know the dog of the neighborhood, then you start to know the person. I feel like those are the kinds of things that happen easier where there's more population density or maybe like Old City has more things happening, but my neighborhood is more residential. So there's less to do. And I found that it was really great just being able to walk and be almost a tourist in my own neighborhood.
Shaquila asks how much and in which ways your interactions with different / your travel shaped your artistic sensibilities.
Well, she and I met in Egypt, so I would say that hello. And I would say that I think the common theme between all the places I've lived and the traveling I've done is understanding that as a 5'3" woman, that there are limitations and there's things that you know, how I navigate. And I think that it helped me understand also all the ways that I can never understand what it is to be in someone else's shoes. It helped me have empathy. It helped me to, I think, inform having work that I hope will become more and more conscious of material and of waste and of saying something that is as universal as possible.
So we have just one last question, or maybe two more, and I know we're coming up on the hour, but Barry says that it's interesting that in both undergrad and grad school, there aren't any courses that were on marketing, or did you take any?
Never.
Now that he's back in the art world after a long hiatus and COVID, he has to reinvent marketing his art, and he wants to know what your thoughts on marketing are.
Well, I would say that probably in terms of reinventing, which, you know, I look at my own website that hasn't been updated since 2018 because I can't find the time, or I don't want to play all the roles of, I think it's figuring out how you can streamline your time. You know, I sent out a mailing list to lots of my friends and thinking about how much time it took to do a MailChimp. You know, I could have hired someone. You know, I think it's just beginning to understand the economics of what is valuable for your own practice and what are the things that you are confident in. And, you know, marketing is a specific kind of it's hard to play all the hats and to be both creative and making, and then also be doing, you know, Instagram and, you know, doing all the things that a business does. I think you have to start to figure out how and who you need help from to, you know, be able to get your work to the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. I know this one too well because it's hard to find the time. We won't go there, but so one more question. I drank out of that mug this morning. I have two of them.
And for those of you, Jeff Kleckner, one of my favorite artists ever, passed away this week. So I've also been thinking about just cherishing, you know, the people you have around you and making sure you call people and, you know, thinking about how handmade anything connects you to another person in another way. So.
Okay, so last question. How does the sense of time / layers of time in Philly compare to the sense of time / history in Nebraska?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think you know, I think, well, you know, you remove, I think it's the difference of people, right? So I think that also, that's another good question. I think, I don't know the answer to that one yet. I might have to wait on that one. Whoever asked that, I'll get back to you. Who asked that?
Heather Schultz.
Oh, hell. Okay, Heather. Heather, we'll talk. I don't know the answer. I don't know.
So my marketing tip for you to end on this would be, you can send a follow-up email with the YouTube link to your talk, and then you can ask anybody to email you back questions that they have if they still have questions. So
perfect. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This is gonna conclude this presentation, but I hope that you'll join us again for the next one. Wednesday, September 23rd at 7 p.m. we'll have sculptor Jeffrey Gorman. And then we've also got a lot of other exciting online events, and you can find them all on the events page at petersvalley.org. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. we're hosting a panel discussion concurrent with our Making Matters exhibition. We'll have 4 esteemed artist instructors, and they'll be in conversation with our studio managers. And then October 10th and 11th, we're holding the 50th annual Peters Valley Craft Fair reimagined online. So register early to receive one of the first 1,003 registrations, or consider purchasing your ticket to support Peters Valley. And lastly, if you'd like to share this lecture or watch it again, we will be posting it on our YouTube channel soon. So thank you, Dominique, and have a wonderful night, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.